Hey there folks, I am Blunty, and if the comments and messages I got in response to the first two parts of this three-part full-on review of the new Android-based game console, the OUYA, this is the one you've been salivating over. Today I'm finally going to show you how this hackable cube does when asked to transmogrify itself into a baker's dozen of other video game playing devices of years gone by. I'm going to take you all the way from the Atari 2600 to the NES, the SNES, the various Gameboys, the TurboGrafx-16, also known as the PC Engine, the Neo Geo, old school arcade machines, the Nintendo 64, the PlayStation, both original and portable flavors, Nintendo DS, and PC games, both from the SCUMM engine and the DOS-based stuff. Now then, the good news is it runs almost all of these things pretty much flawlessly. The better news is that many of these emulators are already available in customized and tweaked OUYA specific versions in the OUYA marketplace. The others will need to be sideloaded and need a bit of button mapping and such to get things working smoothly with the OUYA's gamepad. None of it's very difficult, and it's a set and forget process, so after that, life's easy and breezy, emuleasy. No, that doesn't work. However, you are on your own when it comes to obtaining the ROMs and such though, as that's where the legality gets a bit muddy. So, in a console packing as much compacted capability as the OUYA's maxed out 4-core Tegra 3 brains are, you can pretty much take it for granted that it'll run things as relatively ancient as the Atari 2600 and NES era systems that you're seeing here without the faintest shadow of an issue. The following generations don't pose any issues either. One of my personal favourites, by the way, the Super Nintendo, also known as the wonderfully comedy-sounding acronym the SNES, works beautifully. It's also worth noting at this point that the controller works great with all this stuff, but as it lacks a start and select button of its own, you'll want to either button map those to an unused place on the controller. In the case of most older school stuff, L3 and R3, the thumbstick clicky buttons, will work very nicely for this, and indeed this is the way many natively customized emulators are already defaulted to. In the case you don't want to do that, or don't have any spare buttons to map to, you can also set many emulators to display a start and select button, and indeed other buttons, as on-screen overlays which you can then hit with the OUYA controller's touch-sensitive mouse pad thingy. Again, unsurprisingly, the less demanding stuff like the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance stuff you've been seeing all run perfectly. The slightly more obscure stuff, like the TurboGrafx-16, which some may know better as the PC Engine depending on where you are in the world, run just as nicely, and are worth exploring by the way if you're not familiar with them, as there's some hidden gems in these systems' game libraries which were unfortunately kind of buried beneath the Nintendo and Sega behemoths of the day. The Neo Geo, slightly less obscure, especially to those of us who grew up in the true golden age of arcade gaming, is here too. Although, I have to say, even though the games run beautifully smoothly without a glitch or frame drop as far as the eye can see, somehow it just doesn't feel the same without a proper stick and an inline 4 arcade button layout. The Neo Geo diehards will know what I'm saying, and they will undoubtedly want to use a USB arcade stick for these ones. The same is probably true for the MAME games. And MAME, for the newbies out there, stands for Multiple Arcade Machine Emulator, and it runs thousands of classic and some not so classic arcade games. You have to use an older ROM set, and it is a bit more limited on the mobile version of MAME for Android, but there's still very big piles of truly great games that once upon a time swallowed pocket money faster than Pac-Man sucked down power pellets. Absolutely worth digging for the gems on this one. Moving further along the timeline of game evolution, and we now boldly step into the birth of the modern 3D era. The Nintendo 64 emulator runs relatively great. You'll still get the same kind of odd graphic glitches you'll see in most Nintendo 64 emulators, but for the most part they don't actually affect gameplay in any way. Most of the time they're just some slight weirdness or missing textures such as faces and eyes, which, yeah, it looks super creepy at times, but it doesn't affect the game really. But the good news is that everything runs absolutely smoothly, and even better yet, the analog stick is properly calibrated and perfectly responsive. Full analog control is there and it works brilliantly, and that's very, very important for a lot of Nintendo 64 games.
Nail the weak spot! Oh! It's down!
Now then, the Nintendo 64's bastard half-brother, born out of a failed attempt at Nintendo and Sony working together back in the day, the very first PlayStation is next up. And while the emulator chokes on the occasional game, most seem to run very nicely indeed. Certainly better and faster and more reliably than I've seen on any other Android-based machine I've done this on to date. Oh, and if you're curious about this slightly squishy widescreen thing, yes, you can turn that off and go back to the native 4:3 ratio if you prefer. But I tend to find most 3D rendered PlayStation games don't look too weird if you just let it stretch out and fill the screen. Now, back to the handhelds, and things get kind of janky here. There is a Nintendo DS emulator in the OUYA's market, but it's so not ready for prime time. As we've already seen, the OUYA clearly has more than enough grunt for this level of graphics, but the emulator just is not optimized well enough at this stage to run most games at full speed properly. I tried turning on and off a bunch of options and tweaks, but never really got anything I'd call playable. But it is promising. The games do run, and the controller works fine. It just needs some tender loving care in the code to get things sped up properly. I also sideloaded the PPSSPP PlayStation Portable emulator, which is still a work in progress, and while I did get a couple of games to load, most would either fail or crash during boot up, and those games I did get loaded up to a playable stage ran very poorly indeed. So it's clearly not ready yet, but like the Nintendo DS emulator, we can assume the power is there, but the emulator software just needs a lot more optimization before it's practical and they run properly. But the optimist in me does see light at the end of the tunnel on this one. And not to be left out, we now turn our faces towards the old school PC gamers. The SCUMM engine, SCUMM, is a popular choice for retro PC gamers, as it's the engine that was behind many of the most awesome point-and-click adventure games of their time. Like, for example, Sam and Max Hit the Road here.
A cheerleader. Sam, is pronto a real word?
Now, this isn't natively supported at the moment. It's one of the emulators I had to sideload. And while SCUMM-based games run fine, the controls need to be fixed, especially the mouse control. It's pretty much unplayable at this stage, either with the OUYA gamepad's touchpad or even a proper USB mouse plugged into the console. So once that little problem is tweaked away and the menu and loading screen is made a bit more friendly for the OUYA's TV and control pad experience, it should be great. And last but not least, we hit the DOS-based retro PC games. This is another big sentimental chunk of my personal gaming history, and you really will want either a USB or Bluetooth keyboard for this stuff, obviously, because you'll be doing a lot in the command line, and a proper mouse wouldn't go astray either. Many of these old games will support joysticks, of course, but you really will want a proper physical keyboard to make your life just easy when it comes to this stuff. And man, I kind of miss this old DOS-based command line stuff. Back when, if you're an idiot, you couldn't even use a computer. Not like today when any brain-damaged douchebag can get online instantly and do douchebaggy things to strangers. Back in the day, you had to know your shit, man. You had to know your command line tools. But I'm drifting off topic. Now, I haven't sunk a lot of time into this DOS-based stuff yet, at least not compared to the other emulators, but so far I haven't got the sound working. But aside from that, most games ran wonderfully. Oh, and pro tip, by the way, the Commander Keen series is a great place to start. They're unexpectedly great little platform games. I even got Star Wars Dark Forces booted up first try, although much like the SCUMM games, the mouse control was kind of broken here. Perhaps some more fiddling and remapping on my part would help me bring it up to a playable stage, and perhaps an OUYA specific version of the DOSBox emulation software would help with that. But for now it runs, but you can't quite play it properly. So, there you are. Pictures tell the story. I've just shown you 13 different game systems emulated on the OUYA, and all but a couple of them ran perfectly right out of the box. Others will need some tweaking and polishing to get to a happy place, but I wouldn't hold your breath on anything from the PlayStation 2 upwards though. There's a lot of processing overhead running emulators, and I don't think the OUYA has enough grunt to do that kind of stuff. Maybe in future versions. I did try and sideload an alpha version of a very early stage Dreamcast emulator, but I couldn't even get that one to boot up, so that's why you're not seeing anything here in this video. But for now, between the increasingly great selection of native Android games and OUYA exclusives, which we looked at in part 2 if you missed it, and the big pile of retro and classic game emulation fun that's on offer here, I think the OUYA has earned a place amongst my other game console systems sitting under my TV. All in all, I like the OUYA, and for the $100 asking price, I think it's damn fine value. Anyway, thanks for watching. I am still Blunty, and I will catch you next time.